The Philippine sun cast long shadows across the wildcard boxing gym in General Santos City, as Manny Pacquiao wrapped his hands with the same methodical precision he had perfected over 3 decades. Each loop of tape carried the weight of 8 world titles, 62 professional victories, and the hopes of an entire nation. At 45, his movements still possessed the fluid grace that had made him a legend, though subtle signs of time's passage showed in the deliberate way he stretched his shoulders and the extra moment he took to find his balance. The gymnasium buzzed with familiar energy as his longtime trainer Freddie Roach observed from the corner, clipboard in hand, marking notes with the intensity of a scientist studying a masterpiece. Young fighters paused their own training to watch the living legend work the heavy bag, each thunderous combination sending ripples through the worn leather. The rhythmic sound of gloves meeting canvas created a percussion that had become the heartbeat of Filipino boxing. Jinky sat quietly in the far corner, her usually radiant smile replaced by a contemplative expression that had grown more frequent in recent months. She watched her husband move through his routine with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed both his greatest triumphs and most devastating defeats. Their children's photographs lined the walls nearby, silent witnesses to the sacrifices their father had made in pursuit of greatness. The upcoming bout against Rolando Romero represented more than another payday or another chance at glory. It was positioned as a statement fight, a declaration that the aging champion still possessed the fire that had once made him the most feared southpaw in boxing. Media outlets across the globe had already begun their coverage, with sports journalists flying in from Manila, Las Vegas, and beyond to document what many speculated could be one of Pacquiao's final performances in the ring. In the weeks leading up to the fight, Manny had thrown himself into training with an intensity that surprised even his most devoted followers. His morning runs through the streets of Gensan began before dawn, his footsteps echoing through empty neighborhoods where vendors would later sell his merchandise to eager tourists. Local children would sometimes catch glimpses of their hero jogging past their homes, his breathing steady and determined despite the grueling pace. The financial implications of the fight extended far beyond personal gain. Manny's various charitable foundations depended on the revenue from his boxing matches to continue their work in impoverished communities throughout the Philippines. Schools bore his name, medical centers operated under his patronage, and countless families had received assistance through his generosity. Each punch he threw in training carried the responsibility of supporting thousands of people who looked to him not just as a champion, but as a lifeline. Yet something felt different about this particular training camp. Longtime associates noticed subtle changes in Manny's demeanor during strategy sessions. He would sometimes pause mid-conversation, his gaze drifting toward the windows that overlooked the bustling streets of his hometown. The man who had once approached every fight with unwavering confidence now seemed to be wrestling with thoughts that extended beyond ring strategy and opponent analysis. His medical team had conducted the usual battery of tests, each result scrutinized with the intensity reserved for national treasures. Brain scans, cardiac evaluations, and comprehensive physical examinations had become routine procedures, their importance magnified by the knowledge that every fight at this stage of his career carried increased risk. The report sat in manila folders on his desk, clinical assessments of a body that had endured decades of professional combat. As evening approached and the gym gradually emptied, Manny remained on the speed bag, his movements creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to calm his restless thoughts. The leather responded to his touch with the familiarity of an old friend, each contact producing the sharp staccato sound that had become synonymous with his preparation rituals. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he worked, his breathing controlled and measured, despite the intensity of his effort. The fight was scheduled for just 6 weeks away, and anticipation continued to build across the boxing world. Ticket sales had exceeded expectations, pay-per-view projections looked promising, and Romero's camp had been particularly vocal about their confidence in defeating the aging legend. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan, yet an undercurrent of uncertainty had begun to weave its way through the fabric of the event. The morning of the second week brought an unexpected visitor to the wildcard gym, Dr. Arsenio Valdez, Manny's longtime physician and family friend, arrived earlier than usual, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed heavier than its contents should warrant. His typically warm demeanor carried an undertone of concern as he made his way through the gym, exchanging polite nods with trainers and sparring partners who had grown accustomed to his regular presence during fight camps. Manny noticed the doctor's arrival while working through his stretching routine, the same sequence of movements he had performed before every training session for the past 15 years. The familiar ritual of preparing his body for combat had become a meditation of sorts, each stretch and rotation serving to center his mind as much as his muscles. Yet today the routine felt different, weighted with an anticipation he couldn't quite define. The previous evening had brought troubling news from Kibawe, the small town where Manny's mother Dionysia continued to live, despite his repeated offers to relocate her to more comfortable surroundings. At 73, she remained fiercely independent, insisting on maintaining the simple lifestyle that had shaped her character and, by extension, her son's values. Her modest home, surrounded by neighbors who had known the family since before Manny's rise to international fame, represented a connection to authenticity that no amount of wealth could replicate. Reports from family members indicated that Dionysia had been experiencing episodes of confusion and disorientation that seemed to be increasing in frequency. The woman who had once worked multiple jobs to support her children, who had watched her son rise from poverty to global stardom, now sometimes struggled to recognize familiar faces or recall recent conversations. The local doctor in Kibawe had recommended specialist consultation, a suggestion that carried implications extending far beyond medical care. Jinky had spent much of the previous night on phone calls with relatives, her voice carrying across their bedroom in hushed tones that spoke of family crisis management. The weight of responsibility that came with Manny's success had always extended beyond his immediate household, encompassing extended family, community obligations, and the complex web of relationships that defined Filipino family structure. Every decision carried consequences for dozens of people who depended on his continued earning capacity. The training session proceeded with mechanical precision, but those closest to Manny could detect subtle changes in his usual intensity. His combinations lacked their typical snap, and during breaks between rounds, his attention seemed to drift toward the cell phone that sat silently on the corner table. The device represented both connection and burden, a lifeline to family that could deliver joy or heartbreak with equal unpredictability. Emmanuel Santos, his longtime conditioning coach, adjusted the training schedule to accommodate what appeared to be diminished focus, incorporating more technical work and reducing the high-intensity intervals that typically characterized this stage of camp preparation. The modifications went unspoken, part of the intuitive understanding that develops between fighter and support team over years of shared experience. Meanwhile, promotional obligations continued to mount with relentless efficiency. Interview requests flooded in from international media outlets, each seeking unique angles on what many positioned as a potentially career-defining bout. The narrative had already been established: aging legend versus hungry young contender, experience against ambition, legacy fighting against time. The storylines wrote themselves, but the human complexity behind the headlines remained largely unexplored. Romero's camp had ramped up their public statements, with carefully orchestrated social media campaigns designed to generate controversy and, consequently, pay-per-view purchases. The young fighter's brash confidence stood in stark contrast to Manny's measured public persona, creating the type of stylistic conflict that promoters dream of exploiting. Press conferences were scheduled, media obligations confirmed, and the machinery of modern boxing promotion continued its inexorable advance toward fight night. Yet beneath the surface of professional boxing's choreographed chaos, more fundamental concerns were beginning to surface. The test results that Dr. Valdez carried in his briefcase represented months of comprehensive evaluation, data points that would inform decisions extending far beyond a single boxing match. The intersection of athletic ambition and family responsibility had reached a critical juncture, demanding choices that would define not just the immediate future, but the legacy of one of boxing's greatest champions. Dr. Valdez's examination room at the medical center adjacent to the gym felt smaller than usual. As Manny sat on the edge of the examination table, his championship-sculpted physique somehow diminished by the clinical environment. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across his face, revealing lines that had deepened over recent months and a weariness that extended beyond physical exhaustion. Outside, The sounds of training continued, but they seemed distant and muffled, as if separated by more than just walls. The medical reports spread across the desk told a story that numbers and clinical terminology could barely contain. Brain imaging results showed subtle changes consistent with years of professional combat, patterns that had become increasingly common among fighters who had competed at the highest levels for extended periods. While the findings remained within acceptable parameters for continued competition, they represented a concerning trend that demanded careful monitoring. More troubling were the cardiovascular assessments that indicated minor irregularities in heart rhythm, variations so slight they might escape detection in routine examinations, but significant enough to raise concerns among specialists familiar with the unique demands placed on elite athletes. The heart that had powered Manny through countless rounds of championship boxing was showing signs of the accumulated stress that came with decades of elite-level competition. Yet the most devastating news had arrived not from medical tests, but from a phone call that morning from Kibawe. Dionysia had been found by her neighbor, Remedios Cruz, sitting in her garden at dawn, still wearing the previous day's clothes and unable to remember how she had gotten there. The incident represented a significant escalation in her condition, moving beyond occasional confusion to episodes that suggested more serious cognitive decline. The implications extended far beyond personal concern. Filipino culture placed immense importance on caring for aging parents, and Manny's public image was deeply intertwined with his role as a devoted son. The prospect of his mother requiring full-time care while he pursued what many considered an unnecessary return to boxing created a conflict that cut to the core of his identity and values. Jinky had already begun making arrangements for Dionysia's transfer to Manila, where she could receive specialist care and remain close to family. The logistics were complex, involving not just medical considerations, but the delicate task of convincing a fiercely independent woman to leave the only home she had known for over 4 decades. The process would require Manny's direct involvement at precisely the time when fight preparation demanded his complete focus. The promotional team remained unaware of the developing crisis, continuing to execute their carefully planned media campaign with military precision. Poster designs had been finalized, venue preparations were underway, and international broadcast rights had been negotiated with major networks across multiple continents. The financial ecosystem surrounding the fight had grown to encompass hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity. Training camp dynamics began to shift as Manny's attention became increasingly divided between ring preparation and family responsibilities. Sparring sessions that once concluded with detailed technical analysis now ended with hurried phone calls to relatives and medical professionals. The legendary focus that had carried him through 12 world title fights was fragmenting under the weight of circumstances beyond his control. Freddie Roach adapted the training schedule to accommodate these new realities, shortening sessions and emphasizing technique over conditioning. The veteran trainer had witnessed similar situations throughout his career, understanding that some battles extended far beyond the confines of a boxing ring. His experience told him that forcing intensity when a fighter's mind was elsewhere often resulted in injury or ineffective preparation. Team members began to notice subtle changes in gym atmosphere. Conversations became more subdued, and the usual pre-fight excitement was tempered by an underlying tension that no one felt comfortable addressing directly. The support staff continued their work with professional dedication, but the enthusiasm that typically characterized fight camps had been replaced by a sense of uncertainty about the future. As evening approached, Manny stood alone in the empty gym, shadow boxing before mirrors that reflected not just his physical form but the weight of decisions that would soon demand resolution. The call came at 3 in the morning, piercing through the silence of the Pacquiao household with the urgency that only family emergencies could carry. Manny sat up in bed, his fighter's instincts immediately alert, as Jinky handed him the phone with trembling fingers. The voice on the other end belonged to his cousin Miguel, whose usually calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. Dionysia had been rushed to the regional hospital in Kidapawan after suffering what appeared to be a severe disorientation episode. She had been found walking along the main road leading out of town, wearing only her nightgown and slippers, with no memory of leaving her house or any awareness of where she was trying to go. A local tricycle driver named Celestino had recognized her and safely transported her back to family members who immediately sought medical attention. The hospital's limited facilities could provide only basic care, and the attending physician had strongly recommended immediate transfer to a specialized facility in Manila. The logistics of such a move during the middle of the night were complicated by weather conditions that had grounded most flights, leaving ground transportation as the only viable option for the 8-hour journey to the capital. Manny dressed quickly in the darkness, his mind racing through the implications of this latest crisis. The fight with Romero was now just 4 weeks away, and every day of preparation held critical importance for maintaining the conditioning and mental sharpness required to compete against a younger, hungry opponent. Yet the thought of his mother lying confused and frightened in an unfamiliar hospital room made boxing concerns seem almost trivial. The drive to General Santos Airport took place in pre-dawn darkness, with Jinky handling phone calls to coordinate medical transport, while Manny stared out at the familiar landscape of his childhood. These same roads had witnessed his transformation from barefoot boy to global icon, each mile marking stages of a journey that had exceeded even his most ambitious dreams. Now they carried him toward a crisis that money and fame could not resolve. Dr. Valdez joined them at the airport, having cancelled his morning appointments to provide medical oversight during what promised to be a difficult journey. His presence offered some comfort, though his grave expression confirmed the seriousness of Dionysia's condition. The chartered medical flight that would transport them to Manila represented a luxury that most Filipino families could never afford, yet it felt inadequate given the circumstances. The promotional team's carefully planned media schedule suddenly seemed like an elaborate fiction, as Manny contemplated the possibility that his mother might no longer recognize him when they were reunited. The woman who had sacrificed everything to support his boxing dreams, who had worked multiple jobs to ensure he could continue training despite their poverty, now needed the kind of care that required his full attention and presence. Phone calls from promoters and television executives went unanswered as the small aircraft lifted off from General Santos, carrying the Pacquiao family toward an uncertain future. Below them, the Philippine landscape spread out in the early morning light, a tapestry of rice fields, mountains, and small communities that had always represented home and stability. The view from above offered perspective on how far Manny had traveled from his origins, both geographically and in terms of life circumstances. The realization began to crystallize during the flight that some responsibilities transcended professional obligations, regardless of their financial implications. The contracts that bound him to the Romero fight contained specific performance clauses, but they could not account for the moral imperatives that defined his character. As Manila's skyline came into view, Manny understood that the most important fight he would face had nothing to do with boxing rings or championship belts. The private room at St. Luke's Medical Center felt sterile and cold, despite the warm Manila morning streaming through the windows. Dionysia lay motionless in the hospital bed, her small frame appearing even more fragile against the white linens and medical equipment that surrounded her. The steady beeping of monitors provided a mechanical rhythm that replaced the natural sounds of life she had always been accustomed to in her rural home. Manny stood beside her bed, his calloused fighter's hands gently holding her weathered fingers as she slept under mild sedation. The contrast between their hands told the story of their shared journey from poverty to prosperity, his bearing the marks of countless training sessions and championship fights, hers worn smooth by decades of manual labor and sacrifice. Her breathing was shallow but steady, each rise and fall of her chest a reminder of how precious and fragile life could be. Dr. Patricia Flores, the neurologist assigned to Dionysia's case, had delivered her preliminary assessment with the gentle directness that came from years of delivering difficult news to families. The brain scans revealed progressive cognitive decline that would only worsen with time, requiring full-time care and supervision that could no longer be provided in the rural setting where she had always lived. The medical terminology felt clinical and distant, but the implications were devastatingly clear. The irony was not lost on Manny as he contemplated the situation. His entire boxing career had been motivated by the desire to lift his family out of poverty and provide them with security and comfort. Every punch thrown, every championship won, every endorsement deal signed had been done with his mother's welfare in mind. Now, at the pinnacle of his success, and with one final payday within reach, The very purpose of his career demanded that he step away from the ring. Jinky had spent the morning coordinating with their children's schools and rearranging family schedules to accommodate the new reality. Their eldest son Jimyul had already expressed his willingness to defer his college semester to help with his grandmother's care, a gesture that reflected the family values that had always guided their household. The practical aspects of reorganizing their lives around Dionysia's needs were complex but manageable with their resources. Outside the hospital room, the boxing world continued its relentless advance toward the scheduled fight date. Promotional materials featuring both fighters had been distributed globally, arena preparations were nearing completion, and ticket sales had exceeded projections. The financial machinery surrounding the event had grown too large and complex to halt without significant consequences, creating pressure that extended far beyond personal considerations. Yet as Manny watched his mother's peaceful face, the external pressures seemed to fade into insignificance. The woman who had worked as a market vendor to support his early training, who had celebrated his victories with tears of joy and prayed for his safety during every fight, now needed the same unconditional devotion she had always provided him. The mathematical calculations that typically governed professional boxing decisions, purse percentages, pay-per-view projections, career longevity assessments, became meaningless in the face of filial duty. The decision began forming in his mind with the same clarity that had always characterized his best moments in the ring. Just as he had learned to recognize the precise moment to unleash a devastating combination or the exact instant to change tactical approaches, Manny now understood that some choices transcended strategic considerations. The fight with Romero represented another chapter in his legendary career, but caring for his mother during her time of greatest need would define his character as a human being. Phone calls from his management team went unanswered as the afternoon stretched into evening. The hospital room became a sanctuary where the complexity of modern life temporarily simplified into its most fundamental elements: family, love, and responsibility. The weight of the decision settled over Manny like the familiar heaviness of championship gold draped across his shoulders, except this burden carried no glory, only the profound responsibility of doing what was right. He had spent the entire night in the hospital chair beside his mother's bed, watching her sleep and wrestling with thoughts that pulled him between duty and ambition, between the roar of crowds and the quiet needs of family. Dawn brought clarity that had eluded him in the darkness. As sunlight filtered through the hospital window, illuminating Dionysia's peaceful face, Manny understood that his fighting career had always been about more than personal achievement. Every championship belt, every record-breaking purse, every moment of international recognition had been earned in service of providing security and dignity for the people he loved most. Now that same love demanded the ultimate sacrifice of his professional ambitions. The phone calls began early, starting with his longtime manager, who had sensed something was amiss when Manny failed to appear for scheduled training sessions. The conversation was brief but definitive, marking the first official acknowledgement that the Romero fight would not proceed as planned. The manager's initial protests about contractual obligations and financial penalties gradually gave way to understanding as the family situation was explained in detail. Freddie Roach received the news with the quiet acceptance of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of boxing's emotional complexity throughout his decades in the sport. The veteran trainer had always understood that his role extended beyond technical instruction to encompass the human elements that inevitably influenced every fighter's career. His immediate concern shifted from fight preparation to ensuring that Manny's decision received the respect and support it deserved. The promotional team's reaction was more complicated, involving emergency meetings and rapid consultation with legal experts about the implications of canceling a major event so close to fight night. The financial ramifications were substantial, extending beyond immediate losses to include damaged relationships with broadcast partners, venue operators, and international distributors who had already committed significant resources to the event. Yet even as the business machinery of professional boxing scrambled to address the crisis, a different kind of preparation was beginning in the Pacquiao household. Medical equipment was being installed in their Manila residence to accommodate Dionysia's care needs, while family members coordinated schedules to ensure she would never be alone. The same organizational skills that had managed Manny's global career were now being redirected toward creating a supportive environment for an aging mother's dignity and comfort. The media speculation that began within hours of the first cancellation rumors focused primarily on potential injuries or contract disputes. Standard explanations for last-minute fight postponements in professional boxing. The truth about Dionysia's condition remained within the family circle, protected by the same privacy that had always shielded the Pacquiaos from unwanted public scrutiny of their personal affairs. Manny's children responded to the situation with maturity that reflected their upbringing in a household where family obligations were never negotiable. Princess and Queen Elizabeth had already begun researching specialized care techniques, while Michael and Israel prepared to adjust their own schedules to help with their grandmother's daily needs. The values that had guided their father's rise from poverty were now being transmitted to the next generation through practical demonstration rather than abstract instruction. As evening approached, Manny sat once again beside his mother's hospital bed, this time with the peace that comes from making an irreversible decision based on love rather than calculation. The boxing world would continue without him for as long as necessary, but Dionysia's remaining time with her family was precious and finite. The champion who had never backed down from any challenger in the ring had found his most important victory in the quiet act of stepping away. The official announcement came at noon, Manila time, delivered through a carefully worded press release that cited unforeseen family circumstances as the reason for the fight's cancellation. Within minutes, the news had spread across social media platforms and international sports networks, generating a tsunami of speculation and analysis that reached every corner of the boxing world. The phrase, family circumstances, became the subject of intense scrutiny as reporters and analysts attempted to decode its true meaning. Rolando Romero's camp reacted with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, having invested months of preparation and promotional effort into what they had positioned as a career-defining opportunity. The young fighters' team immediately began exploring legal options while simultaneously seeking alternative opponents who could maintain the scheduled fight date and preserve the significant financial investments already committed to the event. The General Santos community responded with characteristic loyalty, gathering in small groups outside local businesses to discuss the news in hushed, respectful tones. Market vendors like Estrella Montano and tricycle drivers such as Teodoro Villanueva expressed their unwavering support for their hometown hero, understanding instinctively that Manny would never make such a decision lightly. The same people who had watched him rise from poverty to global stardom now rallied around him during his moment of personal crisis. International media coverage varied dramatically in tone and accuracy, with some outlets speculating about serious injuries, while others suggested contractual disputes or financial irregularities. The absence of specific details about Dionysia's condition created a vacuum that was quickly filled with rumors and unsubstantiated theories. Sports commentators who had covered Manny's entire career found themselves analyzing a situation that transcended the usual boundaries of athletic journalism. The financial implications rippled through multiple industries, affecting not only the immediate stakeholders, but also hotels, restaurants, and tourism businesses in both the Philippines and the planned fight venue. Ticket holders faced uncertainty about refunds, while pay-per-view broadcasters scrambled to adjust their programming schedules. The economic ecosystem that had grown around the event represented hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in projected revenue. Yet, beneath the commercial concerns, a deeper story was beginning to emerge about the values that had always defined Manny's character. Former opponents, including some of his greatest rivals, began sharing their own experiences with family obligations that had influenced their careers. The boxing community, often characterized by its competitive ruthlessness, revealed an unexpected capacity for empathy and understanding. Filipino communities around the world organized prayer vigils and support gatherings, demonstrating the global reach of Manny's influence beyond sports. In Los Angeles, New York, and London, Filipino expatriates gathered in community centers and churches to express their solidarity with a man who had always represented their shared values of family devotion and personal sacrifice. The wildcard gym in General Santos remained open, but its atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Young fighters continued their training with renewed appreciation for the relationships that extended beyond boxing. While longtime members shared stories about Manny's unwavering commitment to his mother throughout his career, the gym had become a shrine to priorities that transcended professional achievement. As evening approached, Manny remained at his mother's bedside, largely insulated from the global reaction to his decision. The man who had spent decades in the public eye had found peace in the private act of simply being present for someone who needed him. The courage that had carried him through countless championship fights was now being channeled into the quiet heroism of unconditional love. 3 weeks after the official cancellation, Manny stood before a carefully selected group of journalists in the conference room of a Manila hotel, prepared to share the truth that had remained hidden behind carefully worded statements and protective silence. The room was smaller than the grand venues typically used for boxing announcements, reflecting the intimate nature of what he was about to reveal. The revelation came with quiet dignity as Manny explained his mother's progressive cognitive decline and the family's decision to prioritize her care above all other considerations. Dionysia's condition had reached a point where she required constant supervision and specialized medical attention that could only be provided through the family's direct involvement. The woman who had sacrificed everything to support his boxing dreams now needed that same unconditional devotion returned to her. The assembled media listened in respectful silence as the full story unfolded, understanding finally why a fighter who had never retreated from any challenge had chosen to step away from what many considered an easy payday. The medical complexities of early-stage dementia were explained with the help of Dr. Valdez Oy, who had joined the press conference to provide professional context for the family's decisions. The boxing world's initial frustration with the fight's cancellation transformed into widespread admiration as the true circumstances became clear. Even Rolando Romero's team issued a statement expressing their respect for Manny's choice and their understanding that some obligations transcended professional commitments. The young fighter acknowledged that he hoped to demonstrate similar character when faced with comparable family challenges. Social media platforms that had initially buzzed with criticism and conspiracy theories now overflowed with messages of support and praise for a champion who had shown that true strength sometimes meant walking away from battles that didn't matter. Filipino communities worldwide organized fundraising efforts for dementia research, turning Manny's personal crisis into a catalyst for broader awareness and action. The Pacquiao household had been transformed into a care facility that combined medical necessity with familial warmth, where Dionysia could spend her remaining lucid moments surrounded by the grandchildren whose futures had been secured through her son's achievements. The championship belts that lined the walls served as silent witnesses to a career motivated entirely by love and devotion. As evening descended over Manila, Manny sat with his mother in the garden they had created together, watching her smile at flowers whose names she could no longer remember but whose beauty still brought her joy. The fight that had been stopped would be forgotten by history, but the love that stopped it would endure as his greatest victory. The reason had finally been revealed, and it was simply this: family always comes first,